You're listening to The Secrets of Star Trek, where we discuss the hidden layers and deeper meanings found in all the Star Trek TV series, movies, and more. And today we're discussing the Deep Space Nine episode, The Sword of Kahless. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today on the panel are Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
And Father Jason Tyler. Hey, Father.
Hello.
Folks, be sure to stick around to the end of the... No, actually, I don't have feedback for you this time, but we'd love to get your feedback, and we'd love it if you'd send some in.
Send in more feedback.
That way I can just automatically give you that bit of information about sticking around for feedback and not have to worry about it. But we do love getting your feedback, especially it's enlightening and often amusing, so we really do appreciate it. But remember to like The Secrets of Star Trek on our Facebook page, facebook.com/StarQuestMedia. Retweet us on X, where we're at SQPN. We're on Instagram now. You can even find us on TikTok for as long as that exists. So be sure to go to those places. Go to youtube.com/StarQuestMedia, where you can watch us, but also leave comments. And we'd love to hear from you. So we are discussing this season 4 episode of Deep Space Nine, The Sword of Kahless. Jimmy, can you give us a recap of what happens in this one?
This week, Deep Space Nine does the Canterbury Tales and tells us the Partner's Tale. The Klingon warrior Kor from Star Trek Those Old Scientists is on board the station. He's going in quest of the legendary Sword of Kahless. Dax is going with him, but they invite Worf to come too. The sword is on a planet in the Delta Quadrant, but when they retrieve it, they are immediately set upon by a rival group of Klingons who heard Kor drunkenly explaining what he was going to do in a bar. Our heroes get away from them, but there is a jamming device preventing them from communicating with their runabout. They start making their way up to the surface, but tensions start building between Worf and Kor. And each of them ends up concluding that they should take the sword and rule the Klingon Empire. But just as they are coming to blows, the other Klingons attack again. Worf and Kor defeat them and return to their own battle, but Dax stuns them both and begins interrogating one of the other Klingons about the jamming device. Back on the runabout, Worf and Kor agree that the sword would actually divide the Empire, and they beam it into space to be discovered again when the Klingon race is ready to have it. The end.
All right. Before people write in to correct Jimmy, it's the Gamma Quadrant. You said Delta Quadrant.
Did I?
Yes.
Okay. I'll let the fans sort that. You're right. It is the Gamma Quadrant.
I made that same mistake in my notes when I was writing something. I wrote Delta Quadrant, and then I was looking back this morning and said, "Oh no, it should be Gamma."
Yeah, DS9 Gamma, Voyager Delta. Father, what did you think of this one?
I liked it overall. It's, a Deep Space Nine combination, in some ways, a little bit of Indiana Jones looking for the Holy Grail at the first part, and then some Lord of the Rings type stuff in the second half in terms of, the power of the Sword of Kahless and being sort of like the ring in terms of corrupting the holder of it and everything else. It was nice to have Kor back on screen again, and this was our first really Worf-centric episode, other than, the episode when he first came on to Deep Space Nine. And so first Worf-centric, we get Worf and Dax together on a mission, sort of maybe prepping us for their relationship that's going to develop, and ultimately when they get married. I kept waiting, though, for some revelation that the Sword of Kahless itself exerts some sort of energy, that it does something to make Worf and Kor kind of power hungry and whatnot, because they seem to undergo some very quick changes when they get around the sword, and that's never really explained.
Jimmy, how about you?
Yeah, I like this one overall. It's pretty simple, but you can't beat the Partner's Tale. For people who may not be familiar with the Canterbury Tales, the Pardoner, who is a guy that goes around pardoning people, he does confessions. He tells a story about 3 young men who are gonna meet and defeat death, and they show up at where death is going to be, and there's a big pile of gold, and they end up fighting over the pile of gold and killing each other, and thus end up meeting death. This same story has been told another time in another form on Deep Space Nine. There's an episode where where Captain Sisko has been injured on the Defiant, and Major Kira has to keep him awake and talking, and she tells him this Bajoran story about these three brothers, and it's the Partner's Tale all over again. So it's, I guess, a popular story with the Deep Space write-in staff. But here we have Kor and Worf in the role of the two brothers, and Dax is the sane brother who shoots them both, which was fun to see. This is very, as Father said, this is very early in Worf's time on the show. It's the first episode that really focuses on Worf after he joined, and they did that deliberately to, make this a Worf-centric episode to help integrate him into the mythos of the show. And so Dax has not known Worf for very long, and when he and Kor are fighting, she shoots Worf first. Smart move because he's the stronger one. But then Kor is like, my blood brother, I knew you'd side with me. And she just shoots him too. and that was really great. I know what you mean, Father, about is the sword affecting them in some way. I know people have had that interpretation. It didn't bug me, partly, I think, because I'm familiar with the Partner's Tale, and so I'm looking at it through that lens, and so it's like the thing they find has a corrupting influence on them, not through any mystical means, but just through its own nature. And when you're thinking about, wow, the Sword of Kahless, that would totally divide Klingons. One thing that I thought was not as clear in this episode as it could have been, they keep referring to taking the sword back to the Emperor, and it doesn't emerge until very late in the show that the Emperor they're talking about is not Gowron. It's a clone of Kahless himself, who was introduced in Next Gen. And I think that this would have been much more obvious to people at the time, because they would have had Next Gen much more in their memories. Yeah. But initially I thought they're going to take the sword back to Gowron. And it's like, oh, no, that's right. He's the president of the council, and the figurehead emperor is a clone of Kahless. I think they could have done a little more bringing that out, especially earlier in the episode, and making it clear we're kind of getting the band back together. We've got the Kahless clone emperor. We're bringing him the Sword of Kahless. That would have, I think that would have been good for them to explore that a little bit more.
Definitely should have mentioned the name, like the emperor is Kahless, and it seems appropriate that then we would find his sword and bring it to him. Right. Yeah, that's a flaw. Yeah.
Does this Kahless clone, does he ever show up on screen on Deep Space Nine?
No.
Not on DS9.
Yeah. No. Yeah. He was on Next Gen. They refer to him on DS9 a few times. Besides this episode, there's also, I think there's a reference that he had been opposed to the Klingons fighting the Cardassians or something along the way, but there's no on-screen showing of that.
Yeah. So I like this one. It's a bit of a don't meet your heroes tale. In the sense of, Worf meets one of his heroes and he's not quite, measure up to what he wants him to be. It's a quest story, like you mentioned. I was thinking more like the Holy Grail quest, Arthurian, because the Partner's Tale is not something I'm familiar with. So I was thinking it was kind of had that, and I like the idea that the sword itself did not have some sort of mystical or scientific pull on them, because that means that the corruption, if you want to call it that, was in them. The flaw was in them, not in something external. And I like the exploration of that human nature, Klingon nature, human nature having that flaw.
This is something they really bring out in season 7 once Ezri comes on board. Yeah. And she says, Jadzia was too close to see it, but the Klingon Empire is dying, and frankly, I think it deserves to die. Yeah. And it's like, whoa, okay. Yeah. But they have all this internal corruption.
Sure.
Right.
And, one way they could have brought out a little better this idea of the corruption being within them is if we would have seen a little bit more of both Kor and Worf having some of these ambitious thoughts and things even before they get to the sword. As they're in the runabout approaching the planet, if they're talking not only about delivering it over to the Emperor, but if there's a little bit of a hint of, or maybe I just keep it myself, or maybe we give it to the right person to really unify the Empire. And, well, that could be me.
Or
right up to
they could be talking about how we're going to give the Emperor his sword if you don't want to blow the surprise too quick, that they're both going to want it for themselves.
Sure.
You could say we're going to give the Emperor his sword and then he will reward us richly.
There
and
you go.
I'll be a commander of this and you'll be a commander of that. And,
because it's right up to when they're actually discover the sword, and like even then Worf kind of like, oh no, Dahar Master, you should be the first to hold it. You know, like there's still that deference, that's still that selfless attitude that's being shown, and it's almost, and I can see why you would think that the sword is exerting influence, because as soon as they hold it, suddenly everything's different, and it's kind of abrupt, that change.
Exactly.
They could have done a better job of leading up to that switch over, that showing that the corruption or that lust for power is inherent in them, you know, in their nature. So I agree with that. I really feel like Klingon lore and culture. I know TNG did a lot of development of Klingon lore and culture, but
Ron
I
Moore
think
did.
Yeah, DS9, and because of Ron Moore's influence on DS9, really did more to develop the Klingons than any other show, I think. And by the end of the series, it's a very interesting, fully developed culture that we're looking at that has to die, according to, as you said with Ezri. Like, they have reached the natural end of the empire, of their existence. As such, maybe they need to just, you know, turn into something else. But it's interesting to get all of this about the Klingons, and I really love, you know, having Kang and Koloth and Kor show up. And Kor in this is he's really great, because he's the old warrior who's got all the tales, the old soldier with all the stories and the tall tales, and
he's an unreliable narrator.
Yeah. Well, that's one thing I like is Worf is himself. He's like a Klingon because I read a book, in a sense. Like he's almost like an American with Irish descent, or who's, you know, Italian descent, who is very, very into their heritage and is very black and white about it. Meanwhile, you know, someone from the old country comes along and kind of flouts the conventions and does, you know, poo-poos on the traditions, and it's really disconcerting for Worf to encounter that. And then when it comes down to it, there's that switch, which is Kor is aghast that he let Taral live and didn't take up the right of vengeance, and whereas Worf kind of indulged a human value in the letting Taral, showing mercy to Taral, because he was just a boy.
Taral is the leader of the other Klingons in this episode, and Worf had met him previously when he was a boy, and being part of the House of Duras, he had been allowed to kill him, but Worf spared him instead, and thus he lived to menace them in this episode, which really gets up Kor's nose. Yeah.
So I think it's interesting to see that, you know, in Worf, that conflict between his human upbringing, the Klingon he wants to be, and how other Klingons react to that. It's really, I really think that it's one of the best things about Worf, the character, in all of these stories. So I really enjoy that.
One of the things I really enjoy in this is Dax's role. And I've mentioned that I like how she shoots them both, stuns them.
Yeah.
But there's, you know, earlier on, as they're traipsing through these caves, you know, Worf and Kor are kind of arguing about the sword, and finally, you know, they're about to come to blows before they actually do later in the episode come to blows, but they're about to come to blows over the sword. And like one of them, either, I forget which, Worf or Kor has it, and the other is demanding it, and finally Dax just takes it, and that's the solution. Is she's gonna keep the Sword of Kahless because the other two are getting too handsy with it, and she even like sleeps with it under her so that they can't, you know, get to it easily while she's asleep. And I really like her role in this as kind of the mediator and the sanity keeper.
She even sleeps with the phaser. Like these, like Worf, her colleague, core, her friend from ages ago. But she knows they're still Klingons, and there's something wrong with them. I'm gonna sleep with my phaser. I want to go back to the beginning where Kor is in Quark's bar, and he's telling the tall tale about him and Koloth and Koloth taking on this army, just the three of them alone, and everybody kind of scoffs at it. Bashir and Odo and Kira. The only one who doesn't is O'Brien, which I think is fun because leave it to the Irishman to understand that how the story is told is more important than whether the story is true. But he tells a great story. It's like, that's a very Irish thing to say. And I appreciate that it was O'Brien who they had say it. So I thought that was great.
I like they do something similar in a later season where after Bashir and O'Brien have been reenacting the Battle of the Alamo, they're having a discussion about Davy Crockett, and O'Brien is maintaining the Davy Crockett legend while Bashir is like, oh, but he really wouldn't. I mean, he was this tired Indian fighter at this point, and he wouldn't have really, put himself out in this way. And Worf is like, you are both idiots. Either Davy Crockett died as a hero or he was just a man. If he died as a hero, you should believe his legend. If he died as just a man, there is no point. And it's like, he just totally shuts down their conversation.
That is great. Yeah, that was a good one. I was interested in this idea of the shroud of the sword, that people peddle these shrouds, these relics. And it's kind of, from a historical standpoint, but also from sort of a Catholic standpoint, we have relics. We even have a shroud that people believe or don't believe is, the burial shroud of Jesus. And I feel like there's a lot about Klingons and the Klingon way of seeing things, not the violent aspect, obviously, but just the Klingon reverence for history and for ceremonial objects and ritual that resonates with me as a Catholic. I just kind of I find that interesting, and something about them mentioning this shroud and people having all these shrouds that are part of the tale, and there's this tale obviously that we're not privy to. We get bits of it, but the tale of the sword, and there must be all of these stories out there. So I kind of enjoy the idea of people going on these quests to find the sword and, finding the relics and that sort of thing. So I thought that was kind of a fun little detail.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I thought was interesting is to give Worf motivation to try to take the sword for himself, because otherwise he's too honorable. How do you get Worf to that point? They have the writers created the idea that Kahless appeared to young Worf in a vision and told him he would do something no Klingon had ever done. And he's interpreted that as join Starfleet, but now he's thinking it's more than that, and it involves the sword. And it can still involve the sword. I mean, he's unlike any previous Klingon, he's actually found it. Mm-hmm. But they don't follow up on that vision. Unfortunately, they just kind of drop it. Mm. And I would, if I was a writer for the show, I would say, oh no, if Worf has gotten, or thinks he's gotten a revelation, from the supernatural, you need to build on that. That's a character arc, and you can have him question, was that really a vision later? And you can have him ultimately conclude in season 7 that it was, but you need to explore that.
That's a lost opportunity. Even, we see Worf again in the Picard series, and, it's not something it's something we could return to if we ever get Star Trek Legacy or whatever. Yeah. That would be fun.
Yeah, but what they should have done is since this is the episode where they're rooting Worf in the mythology of this show, is they should have established that, and okay, that's Worf's character trajectory for the next 3 seasons. What was that vision all about?
Interesting. Yeah, that would have been, because you could do a lot with that. Yeah. How did the sword get to the Gamma Quadrant 1,000 years ago? Like they say the Herc, which means just aliens in Klingon, plundered the planet and took the sword and plundered many planets and brought their treasures back to their planet. But
they
it's
apparently
still a long
went
way.
Through the wormhole.
They must have, I guess. I guess this was, I mean, to get to the Gamma Quadrant at warp speed, 75, Voyager traveled from Delta, they were going to travel from Delta Quadrant. It would take them 75 years. So, I mean, it's possible that the Herc were long-lived and traveled great distances.
It's possible, but this planet is apparently very close on the other side of the wormhole.
That's true. And maybe they knew about the stable wormhole at the time, 1,000 years previously.
Or could have even accidentally stumbled upon it somehow.
Mm-hmm.
It is weird that they just beam the sword into space and then kind of assume, well, someone will find it again. I mean, it's in the middle of nowhere.
They say it could be lost for 1,000 years, and I'm going like, or 1 billion.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose, from a belief standpoint, I'm not going to say necessarily religious belief, but kind of a religious belief, they believe that there's a fate or destiny tied to the sword and that it wants to be found. I mean, they use that sort of language in the episode itself, this idea that the sword has a destiny and that it wants to be found. And so maybe it will arrange for itself to be found at some point, something along those lines.
It is a really nice final shot, though, as the runabout flies off, to watch the sword just spinning in space.
That was a very good visual. I like that Sisko very quickly, we kind of jump right to, Sisko saying, sure, go ahead. This is a great idea because it will help. It'll help politically, diplomatically, to have these two Starfleet officers, including the only Klingon in Starfleet, help recover this invaluable relic of the Klingon Empire. Although I'm curious when they get back. You had it, but you got rid of it. I mean, I'm sure Jedzi will explain why they had to get rid of it. But nevertheless, it's nice to see Sisko has a good reason to let them go. And Kor's reason for Worf to go is, it'll annoy Gowron, which I think is a funny reason. He says it several times.
There is that really nice moment where Kor first meets Worf in Quark's bar.
Yeah.
And he's like, Worf, the traitor? And you're not sure which way this is going to go. You're expecting him to denounce Worf. But then he's like, so nice to meet you.
Yeah.
and he doesn't care at all that Worf is a traitor because he knows who Gowron is. He's not impressed with Gowron or who he declares a traitor. But that's a nice moment. Also, one of the things that I always do in episodes like this, the regular actors need to get paid for this episode. And now they don't have to. If they had no lines, they wouldn't get paid. But in order to get paid, they need a line. And so whenever I know an episode is going to focus on certain characters, I'm always looking for, okay, let's see how our others get their lines. And so in that opening scene where Kor is telling his story in the bar, we have this shot where we pan around to all of the regulars except Sisko, who offer their comments on the story and how they don't believe it and so forth. And then since it's his bar, Quark also has a line. And then we jump to Sisko's office and he has a very brief scene. But it's like, okay, we're getting all of our regulars paid for this episode, and then we can focus on our real story, which is Jadzia, Worf, and Kor.
Right.
It was interesting. When I finished watching it, I thought, wow, did we have an episode that did not have Odo and Kira and O'Brien and Bashir? And then I realized, oh, wait, they were at the very beginning, but I'd forgotten about their role until the very end, because it is such a superficial, just kind of throw it out there and get them off screen kind of situation.
Yeah, we didn't get any Jake or Nog. They're the only regulars that didn't get their lines.
Those two frequently don't show up.
Yeah.
Well, Nog's not even in the opening credits, so I mean,
that's true.
Kind of a recurring character more than a regular, I guess.
He's not quite up there yet. Yeah, he will be later.
Right.
I had to laugh. Dax getting past the force field by reversing the polarity, which welcome to Doctor Who. And so that was good. What was I going to say? Oh, I want to get your opinion. Do you think Worf was really trying to kill Kor by dropping him off the cliff?
So this is something that I was going to comment on this. I think Worf is torn in his heart. So for people who haven't seen the episode, there's this moment where they're going through the caves and Kor slips off of a ledge and he's got the sword, and Worf tells him there's a ledge just below you.
Because Worf is holding the other end of the sword.
Worf's holding the other end of the sword. And he says, let go of the sword and you'll be okay. You'll land on this ledge. And Kor looks down and he can't see the ledge. And he says, I can't see it. And I'm not letting go of this sword. And there's a really nice moment where Jadzia, she's behind Worf and holding on to Worf so she can't look over the edge to see whether there is a second ledge or not. But Worf is telling Kor to let go of the sword and land on the ledge. And Dax is like, okay, if there's a ledge down there, why don't you let go of the sword, Worf? And he's not willing to do that. And finally, Jadzia is like, okay, we'll pull you up. And they manage to do that. And then silently, without saying anything, Kor looks over the ledge to see what's down there. Is there a second ledge or not? And he then walks off. He doesn't say anything. But Jadzia looks over and she does say something. And she brings it up to Worf and says, yeah, okay, there is a little ledge there, but that would not have held him. You wanted him to die. Right. And I think Worf is ambiguous in his heart. He kind of did and didn't want Kor to die. And that's why, and he, on some level, he knew that the second ledge was not enough, which is why he wouldn't let go of the sword. So he was kind of halfway trying to send Kor to his death at that point.
Right.
Yeah. That's how I took it. Father?
Yeah.
I would, yes, a little interior conflict, I think, going on in Worf there, because you're right. He could have just, dropped Kor, I guess, in a couple of different ways. But part of him, I think, would love to see Kor die. Just he gets out of the way, and Worf has the sword for himself. But there's also a good part of him that probably recognizes the dishonor in doing something like that, and so is not.
Yeah, I think Worf was ashamed.
Mm-hmm,
yeah,
right.
Yeah, it really comes true when he's told let go of the sword, then let go of the sword and let him drop to the. But we might lose the sword. Well, if you lose the sword, you're also going to lose Kor. You're more concerned about losing the sword than you are about losing this hero that you've looked up to. You could see the conflict in him there. Yeah. I think it was well done by having Jadzia being the one confronting him and not Kor either in that moment. And if you could just pull him up, then why didn't you just do that in the first place? But yeah. So I'm trying to think of other things I had here in my notes that we didn't cover yet. Anything else for you all, Father?
Nothing particular, just kind of an overall, general observation. Both Worf and Kor were excited to pursue the sword, but they're able to part with it once they recognize how much trouble it's causing for each of them, and they can imagine how much trouble it's going to cause the rest of the Klingon Empire if it gets, sort of out there publicly. And they recognize in the end they were okay before without it, and they're able to part with it. And it's maybe a lesson for all of us, not just on big things, but any material things. Are there things that we don't need, things that we can easily part with, that we should be ready to do so when we need to?
Yeah, Kor comes into this, in fact, at one point he says, this is my last chance for glory, and really comes down to it. That's really what this is about. It's not really about the Empire. For him, it's really about trying to reclaim the glory of his younger days. That whole story he tells at the beginning, he's at the end of his life, and he's winding up, and he's had so much glory and excitement as a Klingon warrior. He wants one last run at this, and this is the big score, or you could compare it to heist movies and that sort of thing, and his enthusiasm and his motivation sort of infects both Jadzia and Worf, who aren't out it for one last shot at glory for Kor, but kind of glom on to, this reason that Kor gives that's external to him. But really what it boils down to, Kor wants that one last shot of glory, wants to have that moment in the Hall of Heroes and have his statue be raised, which to be honest, he'll probably get if Koloth and
Kang.
Kang, sorry. Yeah, Koloth and Kang have gotten statues. So is Kor, that's just going to happen. But yet he just has, I think it's this insecurity in him and this need for glory too. So I thought that was an interesting look inside of why Kor was doing this. How about you, Jimmy? Any other notes?
Nope, there's some minor stuff, but nothing particularly worthy of note.
Okay, very good. Then that should do it for us this time. Before we go, we'd like to take a moment to thank our patrons who make it possible for us to create the Secrets of Star Trek, including JPD, Thomas B, Andrea M, Eric A, and Cher W. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue the Secrets of Star Trek and all the shows at StarQuest, and you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. So that's it from us. What did you think of the Sword of Kahless? You can let us know by commenting on the show at sqpn.com/trek, our Facebook page at facebook.com/StarQuestMedia, send an email to trek@sqpn.com, or visit our Discord community at sqpn.com/discord. You can also watch The Secrets of Star Trek on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/StarQuestMedia. We'll be back next time when we'll be discussing the Voyager episode, Elogium. Yes, Cass's puberty. Until then, Jimmy Akin, thank you for joining me and sharing the Secrets of Star Trek.
Thank you, and kapla!
And Father Jason Tyler, thank you as well.
Thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to the Secrets of Star Trek on StarQuest, and remember, big heart.